I'm Lalebe Bahanyan, and I'd like to welcome you to Global Sociology Live. This is an undergraduate seminar that I'm teaching with Michael Buravoy here at the Department of Sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, where we will be bringing a series of live discussions to you where our students will actually be in conversation with a range of different sociologists and scholars residing in different parts of the world to discuss a range of issues that are related to what we are calling global sociology. So these conversations are going to be posted on the website of the International Sociological Association. They'll also be posted on the Berkeley YouTube website. And there is a blog for this seminar at globalsociologylive.blogspot.com. And we encourage you all to join in there on these conversations. Next week, our guest is going to be Michael Watts, who is a professor of geography and development studies here at University of California, Berkeley. And he's going to be speaking with us on the issue of oil, dispossession, and violence. But today, we are extremely honored to have with us Dr. David Harvey, distinguished professor in anthropology at the City University of New York, where he is also the director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. Dr. Harvey is a renowned geographer and the author of numerous highly influential books that have been translated into many languages, including The Limits to Capital, The New Imperialism, and also A Brief History of Neoliberalism, which will be the focus of our discussion today. Professor Harvey has been teaching Marxist Capital for almost 40 years now, and he's been at the forefront of efforts to bring Marxist theory to a critique of global capitalism today, and particularly to neoliberalism. And we'd like to thank you, Dr. Harvey, for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
Very good.
So Dr. Harvey is actually going to begin by giving us about the 10 to 15-minute lecture on the history of neoliberalism, after which we're going to open up to a conversation for about 30 minutes. So, Dr. Harvey,
Okay, let's give him a bit of applause.
Well, this is a first for me, so I've never done this before, so we'll see how it goes. I wanted to say that, about 10 years ago, I started to find myself in the situation of wondering how on earth we got to the present conjuncture. And I found a lot of students really didn't know that very well either. People who came to sort of understand the world, being born in the era of Reagan or even later under Clinton, were not really kind of cognizant of what had preceded it and the kind of world that had changed during the 1970s and 1980s and brought us to our present state. So I thought I'd like to write, in a way, my own political autobiography. That is to sort of give a description of the world that I had lived through from the 1960s onwards. And looking back, you start to see things that are significant, which you didn't notice so much at the time. And so the neoliberalism book is a reconstruction of how politics and economics has changed since the late 1960s through the 1970s and 1980s. And this encompassed some extremely important phases where, for instance, the deindustrialization of much of the United States. I was living much of this time in Baltimore. And when I went to Baltimore in 1969, there were something like nearly 30,000 people employed in Bethlehem Steel. There's now nobody employed in Bethlehem Steel. It went bankrupt anyway some time ago. And even during the 1980s, the numbers of people working in blue-collar jobs were just dropping off like flies. And Baltimore went from being a blue-collar city to being a white-collar city in about 20 or 30 years. And the devastation that occurred in many parts of the United States, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, you name it, all the industrial cities, So I was interested in rewriting that history and asking the question, how did it occur? And as I did so, it seemed to me very important to look at the crisis of the 1970s and the sorts of difficulties that existed in the global economy in the 1970s. The huge kind of problems towards the end of labor relations, of fiscal difficulties, of urban difficulties, which then led me to sort of start to think about the transitions that occurred and how this country came out of that world and started to enter another world. And for me this was a terribly important story to be told. And it wasn't only, of course, about the United States. It was also about what was happening in Latin America through the military dictatorships, the Pinochet in Chile, the Argentinian generals. But it was also happening more and more in Europe, although not at the same rate, but particularly in Britain with the kind of what might be called the Reagan-Thatcher revolution. So you have Reagan and Thatcher on the cover of the book as being sort of crucial figures in this whole transition, along with Pinochet. But then also, of course, during this period we saw something else beginning, which has now become even more significant, which was the revolutionary transformation of what was going on in China. And the reforms that Deng Xiaoping produced after 1979, and then that went through. So in a way what I wanted to do was to write the history of that, to talk about the politics of it, how that politics came to be. And it seemed to me more and more that this was about a class assault. It was about a class that was beginning to work in its own interest. And you go back to the 1970s and you see the formation of all of these institutions, like the Business Round Table, the Chamber of Commerce, all of the think tanks, and the Heritage Foundation suddenly became big, and a vast amount of finance went into persuading us to see the world in a different way. And what we were being taught was that actually the state did not have responsibility for our own well-being. We had to take that on ourselves. And increasingly, of course, what neoliberalization was about was the privatization of social functions, the privatization of public utilities, and of course in Europe it meant the privatization of formerly held state companies. So there was a wave of privatization, but also a system of personal responsibility was increasingly put into place, which was going to displace the way in which the state had, if you like, supported the social wage before that. So this revolution in the way capitalism worked has been going on since the 1970s, and it continues to this day. For example, one of the things that has happened with this financial crisis that we've just been through is that we've saved the banks, and now we've said that people have to pay. So we now have, if you like, this whole kind of push of trying to get rid of all social programs. But this was a strategy that was actually adopted by Reagan. In the Reagan administration, you have a situation where Reagan cut tax rates on the rich from something like 70% to 30%. He waged a Cold War with the Soviet Union, a vast kind of military deficit. And they went deeply into debt. And his budget director at some point said our strategy was to increase the debt so that we could then savage all of the social programs. Now Bush, of course, has followed the same thing in 2001. 2 unfunded wars of choice, a vast reform of Medicare, which gave a lot of money to big pharmaceutical, and of course vast tax cuts. And the result is you've got a vast deficit in the world right now. And as a result of that, we're now seeing the Republicans in Congress saying the answer to this is cut all the social programs, undercut, Medicare, Social Security, all the rest of it. And in fact, there's been a strategy since the 1970s for capital to take no responsibility whatsoever for social reproduction, for the care of the aged, the sick, and the well-being of the people. And this is a strategy which has been consistent from the late 1970s onwards, and it was first pioneered in the New York City debt crisis of 1975-76, and it was then taken global by the International Monetary Fund in 1982 in the developing world debt crisis, in which Mexico was getting in deep into debt, And in order to save the New York investment bankers who had invested a lot of their money in Mexico, Mexico was bailed out by the IMF and the US Treasury, so the US bankers did all right. But in return, the Mexican debt had to be retired by a cut in the standard of living of the people, and the standard of living of the people dropped by 25%. And this is the kind of situation we face right now. We bailed out the banks, and the banks did fine. We've now increased the state debt, and how are we saying it's going to be paid for? It's going to be paid by you and me and social programs, either by cutting social programs or making us pay more, and you in California will surely know that you're paying more for your tuition than you have before. And so this is the kind of world which was created through the 1970s, and it continues to this day. So neoliberalization is not dead. In fact, it's very, very active right now, and therefore I think what I tried to do was to talk about the history of this strategy, how it came to be in the 1970s, and then to talk about its continuation and its proliferation over time through the IMF on a global basis, and then, of course, right through to the present crisis, which is not covered in the neoliberalism book, but which I take up in the last book I did, which is The Enigma of Capital. So this is the story I wanted to tell, and I wanted to do it in a way that at least most people could grasp. I mean, we Marxists are famous for writing things that are so incomprehensible that nobody understands what we're talking about, but I tried to make it as comprehensible as possible. So if you have any complaints about that, please let me know, because I'll try and make something simpler next time around. So with that, why don't I turn it back to you and get your sort of feedback, because I know you've read some of it, and we can have a discussion on various aspects of it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Harvey. So if it's okay, our students actually have some questions to pose for you, so if we can go right to that. Right. Sandra?
All right. Should I wait for the camera? Or should I just ask my question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So when I was reading your book, and I come from a Latin American country. I'm from Peru, where we also had some uprisings during the 70s and 80s. And my main question is, considering what's happening in Egypt right now, from your perspective, from, I dare to say from a Marxist perspective, talking about class antagonism and people revolting and organizing, what do you think is the main difference of some societies, some people actually organizing and not consenting to what the state gives them, or what the order is, and what's the main difference? I feel like here in America, everything is somehow comfortable, and some people do revolt and some people do organize. But when I see people in Egypt, I'm just like, whoa, blown away by how this has escalated. So I guess my question is, what do you think? Like, what is it that drives people to revolt?
Well, I don't think there's any one single answer to that question. One of the things I guess I emphasize as a geographer is that there's a tremendous amount of difference, both cultural and in terms of the particular situation of a country. There are different political traditions. For example, in Greece, there's been a much stronger reaction to the crisis than there has been in some other places, but they have a tradition. Political tradition of doing that. The French, for example, have a political tradition of taking to the streets in ways that the British have never done. So there are many, many differences of that kind. So I don't want to get into a sort of one-shoe-fits-all kind of explanation of anything. Now, I don't really know much about Egypt, and so I'm the last person in the world to ask, but there are a number of things that, given where I come from, I look for clues in the reporting. And the reporting generally has been in the United States that this is a struggle for individual liberty and freedom, and the typical things that Bush loved to talk about in all of his speeches and so on. So it gets filtered through, if you like, an American vision of the world. But one thing I do know is that throughout all of North Africa, over the past 30 years, there's been a good deal of unrest, and one of the keys to the unrest has been the price of food. Now, how many reports have you seen about food prices in Egypt? Now, I went and tried to find a little bit out about that, and food prices have escalated like crazy. I mean, grain prices right now are going through the roof, and even my bagel in New York City has been going up in price. But basic foodstuffs have been rising in price, and that is traditionally, and particularly in North Africa, you see a history of uprisings and unrest around the question of food prices. And food prices in those countries are not entirely free market established. There's very often a great deal of state mediation, so the state then gets into the middle of it. So that's one element in the situation that I think we should pay much more attention to. The other element in the situation I noticed the other day was that there was a reporter from NBC who kind of had spent a lot of time in Egypt, maybe 20 years ago or 15 years ago, something like that. So he lived there for about 3 or 4 years. And he lived in a very poor neighborhood. Now, one of the things he commented was, the thing that's very different now from then was, people were poor, but nobody was super rich. He said, but now the situation is that poor people are as poor as they ever were, but they see a whole class of super rich emerging. And I look at that and I say, well, these are the kinds of things that need to be probed into. I have no idea how many people in the square are actually animated by those concerns. I have no idea. But there are kinds of things that I would want to hear more about because, again, historically, you'll find unrest emerging in a situation where food prices in particular, back in the 19th century there were food riots, and so this is not an uncommon sort of thing. So I'm kind of interested in finding out more about that. But like I say, I'm not an expert on Egypt, and I would hate to say what's going on. I just dislike the way the American media treated it as somehow or other a function of Facebook and Twitter and a struggle for individual liberty. That may be in this part of the mix. I'm sure it is. But what is the actual mix that is creating an incredible ferment on the ground?
Thank you.
Thank you for asking the question.
So, Pia?
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question which is a little bit in relation to that question, because I would like to hear your thoughts about the possibilities of resistance within neoliberalism, like how should organizing happen against neoliberalism in the stage that the world is now, like what institutions should you put your demands forward to, if you should at all put any demands forward to institutions, and like what role do you see that the national states are playing in this? In your chapter you're like, it doesn't seem that that we can use the national states very much, since they are like becoming neoliberal states. Like what are their roles in that, and as well, as far as I see it, like embedded neoliberalism or social democracy, for that reason, is not like the answer, or not what you should like fight for. So yeah, I would like to hear your thoughts about that, and also in terms of like, it seems like that the global movements or movement against neoliberalism is so much behind in terms of organization compared to the neoliberal institutions. So yeah, where do you see resistance should come from, and what should it fight for?
Well, I wish I had all of the answers to those questions. Then we'd have a revolution, and it would be great. But the thing that's very, I think, very important to recognise is that one of the things that in the 70s and 80s in particular, there was, if you like, an assault upon traditional forms of labour organisation and the political parties that went alongside of it. So there was an assault. And effectively, of course, those labour organisations were largely destroyed by a number of means, by offshoring, by technological change. I mentioned Baltimore. When I went to Baltimore in 1969, if you wanted to do something in the city, you went to the Steelworkers Union, and if the Steelworkers Union mobilised, you knew things would happen. Well, there's no Steelworkers Union that you can mobilise now. So traditional forms of organisation have been dismantled, many of them. And as a result of that, you need then to reconstruct, as it were, completely different institutional forms. And of course, we see some of those emerging in social movements of various kinds. But the genius of neoliberalism was it came up with something about keeping that kind of discontent under wraps, which are called the NGOs, non-governmental organizations, which are very much, they're not democratic, they do some very good things, and some very good people get into them, but in the end they're beholden to their sponsors. And of course there are a lot of organizations which are, supported by Gates Foundation or Soros or the ultra-rich. So a lot of the discontent gets channeled and organized through the NGOs into something which is about trying to cure the symptoms of poverty without in any way interfering in the accumulation of wealth. And I keep on saying to people who are into anti-poverty movements, you're in the wrong kind of movement. You should be in an anti-wealth movement. I mean, but of course that's unthinkable, pretty much, these days. So we have a big problem on how to think about this. Now, there are, of course, some things that have occurred, like the World Social Forum. There was the period before 9/11 when, the Seattle events and those kinds of things, and you started to see the lineaments of a new kind of politics coming into being. And there have been some pretty phenomenal events over the last 20 years. I mean, for example, the millions of people around the world who turned out on February the 15th, 2003 to protest the Iraq War. I mean, it was a huge global demonstration, but then everybody demonstrated and then they went home. That's the problem. And, for instance, the huge demonstration in this country over the immigration law that was passed. I mean, millions of people participated, and then they all went home. So, we have a problem that there are a lot of people who I think are feeling that the world is not going in the right way, but we have this real difficulty of coming up with a form of organisation that can somehow or other stick. And if necessary, we also have to deal with the kind of anti-statist ideology on the left. I mean, yeah, it's right, most states have become extremely neoliberal. But if they became neoliberal, they can become something else, if there is political pressure mobilised upon them. But there are large groups on the left that say they want nothing whatsoever to do with state power. And I think the state is a very important institution, and there are sets of institutions within the state which I think is terribly important to grasp if we really want to make a change right now. And you see that demand is beginning to emerge in some countries, in Southern Europe, for example, and of course we see it emerging in Egypt. How that demand is going to be met, and whether it will be met with violence or whether it will be met with concessions, and if so, will it just be neoliberal concessions? That's kind of for history to tell, and that's up to us to decide in some ways in terms of what we do, as far as that's concerned.
Thank you, Kevin.
In your book, you talk about how neoliberalism has brought a change in class dynamics or in power concentration from a traditional aristocratic elite to a more financialized class elite. And I was wondering what you think about a country like Saudi Arabia, where you still have a very entrenched aristocracy, but also this large globally acting state-owned enterprise in the country, and where it fits, a country like that fits into neoliberal expansion. And also, if you think countries like this maybe are like to be shielded from neoliberalism because of their relationship with the United States and with their position in the global market itself. Well,
I don't make the argument in the book that the sort of neoliberalism just kind of went like this everywhere. In fact, there are many parts of the world where neoliberalism was only partially implemented. We still see in countries like Germany that you have a sort of social safety net, which comes from way back, which is not purely neoliberal at all, although you see Angela Merkel starting to use the current debt thing to try to go after that. So the argument is not that everywhere goes that way, and in a pretty autocratic country like Saudi Arabia, obviously there are certain compromises which are made with the global economy, and of course the United States has long made a pact with Saudi Arabia about you keep the oil flowing and we'll defend you, and sell you all of the arms and equipment you need. The other thing about Saudi Arabia is that most of the working population is not Saudi. So much of it is, from Palestinian territories or from Southeast Asia or India or wherever. So you have a society there that can exist within the neoliberal frame, and benefit from it, but without necessarily bringing in all of the institutional arrangements which are familiar with neoliberalism. But that is also true of other countries. For instance, the Nordic countries. I mean, Sweden has not gone totally neoliberal. I mean, it has in some respects, but not in others. And so I think that you have to look at the specificity in each instance. And so the argument is not that there's some pure form of neoliberalism, but that there are different forms of neoliberalism emerging in different countries, and that there is some sort of competition going on between them. I mean, for example, the kind of neoliberalism, if you can call it that exists in China, seems to me right now to be outstripping everything else. So if we really want to be successful, I guess we should all become like China. But again, there's competition, if you like, between different models of governance and different models of development. And the United States, it seems to me, has got into a situation right now where its ideology is fixated on certain things which actually do inhibit an economic revival at some sort of pace. I mean, for example, you want to stimulate the economy, and this is a familiar argument. You want to stimulate the economy. Well, you don't do it by sort of throwing people out of work and by cutting all the social programs and putting municipal governments and state governments to the wall. You just don't do it that way. So this is a diverse situation, and politics enters in big time into how different countries end up embracing some version of neoliberalism.
Thank you.
Elena?
Yes, I would like to ask you one question regarding the second chapter of your book, The Construction of Consent. And you're actually stating that construction of consent in democratic societies is actually based on the discourse of freedom, and that construction of consent is necessary in order to actually embrace neoliberalism in democratic societies, and that discourse of freedom, individualism, and justice is just a camouflage for increasing social inequality and growing of this new elite, of this new class. But my main question is, what about democratic countries where sometimes primary needs of people are not actually satisfied? Can really the discourse of justice and freedom work for them too?
Well, I think one of the genius things that Marx did is to problematize concepts like freedom. He kind of said, the worker is free. They're free in the double sense, he says, that they're free to contract their labour to whoever they like, but they've also been freed of any control over the means of production. So they have no choice whatsoever except to be wage labourers. So he makes it very ironic about the notion of freedom. So when Bush, in his inaugural speeches, some of which I quoted in the book, keeps on going on and on and on about freedom, it's a second kind of freedom, i.e. the freedom of dispossession of access to the means of production, so you become a free labourer in a free market, which is then available for exploitation. So you problematize the notion of freedom. And then there's a question of justice. So, what's the definition of justice? There's a great part in Plato's dialogues where one of the characters, Thrasymachus, says, justice is whatever the most powerful people say it is. And justice and freedom in a neoliberal society are about just desserts for entrepreneurial endeavor. And
my
yeah.
question actually is how can that rhetoric, like that rhetoric of freedom, be appealing to someone who doesn't have food or doesn't have electricity, who is unable actually to live normally? How can that rhetoric be appealing? Because I sometimes have a feeling that in some European countries, for example, I'm from Croatia, and people don't, the consent is not really necessary. People are not asked if they want neoliberalism. It is presented as something that's necessary in order to keep up with the others. So people are not really given a chance to choose.
Yes, right. No, I think that's right. I mean, and that's what Margaret Thatcher basically said when she said there is no alternative. We have to go the neoliberal way. That's the only way we can go. But it's always held out in this rhetoric of freedom, individuality, just desserts for your efforts. So it's put that way. And of course, what that then leads into is that if you are not getting enough to eat, if you are not being successful, it's your own fault. And one of the things that strikes me about the United States in the foreclosures, many people interpreted the foreclosure as their own fault. It wasn't a systemic thing at all. And it's been very difficult. So this is why I think the neoliberal ideology is very pernicious. Once we internalize it, we say, oh, it's my fault. That I'm not successful. I don't have enough food because I haven't worked hard enough, or I haven't gone out and got a job, or something of that kind. So there's a question of blaming the victim, which is always present. But under neoliberalism, it takes on this particular guise in which we internalize that it's our fault that we haven't succeeded.
Sona?
What specific elements of the economic crisis was neoliberalism put forth as being able to solve? I don't quite understand how the crisis, the economic side, not the political project that you talk about, but what elements of the crisis was neoliberalism put forth as being able to solve?
Well, I don't think the political response was to appeal to neoliberalism, but the practical response was to do what neoliberalism had been doing since the Mexican debt crisis, since the New York fiscal crisis, which is to bail out the banks and then make the people pay. That was, if you like, the formula, which was arrived at in the middle of the 1970s. And when the banking crisis began, there was an immediate rush to bail out the banks, without, of course, in any way extracting anything from the banks, that is, converting them into, say, public utilities or changing their management or anything of that kind. The banks were rescued without putting any great demands upon their institutional framework or their personnel. And that was because that was the class. That's the class of Wall Street, as I call it, And the class of Wall Street said, basically, leave us alone. And they've been doing extremely well. I mean, New York City is a great place to be right now because the Wall Streeters are doing fine. And there's plenty of money flowing around in the city amongst that particular class. So they came out of it fine. And then the question arose, well, if government bailed them out, you shifted the crisis from a banking crisis to a debt crisis of the state. And now we're paranoid, throughout much of the world we're paranoid about this debt crisis. And saying, we've got to cure the debt crisis. How do we do that? Well, we sock it to the people. That's what they did in Mexico. And that's what they're doing right now. So right now, with the Republicans coming into Congress, it's sock it to the people time, having rescued the banks 2 years ago. And the same thing's happening in Ireland, by the way. The same thing's been happening in Greece. The sovereign debt crisis is now an excuse to reduce the standard of living. So, if you like, the neoliberal recipe which has been there, which has never been explicit, because I don't think people like to talk about it that way, But I mean, I like to talk about it that way because it makes, I think, very clear what is going on. But the mainstream press doesn't talk about it that way at all. But it says, well, okay, there's a debt crisis, and we don't ask where it came from and what the role of the banks was in creating the debt crisis. Well, we just simply look at the debt crisis and then say, what's the answer to the debt crisis? Well, fiscal austerity. So they've now got austerity.
But
sort of
David,
being launched. Yeah.
David, but I think the question is more. I mean, you say that it all begins in the 1970s. So what is the crisis that you're talking about? Is it something that you're saying now is spontaneous, is sort of created by a class, or is there something systemic that happens in the 1970s? What is the real? There's a tension in the book that you talk a lot about the political project and the class project, but the economic project, the economic crisis of the 1970s are not spelled out. What is the character of that crisis that gives rise to this swing away from the class compromise that existed before?
Well, a simple answer, simple answers are always wrong in the end, but the simple answer is Labour was too strong. Labour was too well organised, it was too strong, it was pushing on the social wage, big time, it was beginning to support an anti-corporate agenda, so that you do get, for example, in the early 1970s, I mean, Nixon, a conservative Republican, and one of the things I used to say was, well, the good thing about Nixon is you can't possibly find a president who's worse, but that's been absolutely untrue. So he signed into law things like the Environmental Protection Agency, consumer protection. There's a whole raft of anti-corporate legislation which passed through Congress in the very early years of the 1970s. And this was an expression of popular power, but it was also an expression of the power of Labour, both in the market but also politically. The same was true, of course, in Britain with the Labour Party and throughout much of Europe. So, put very simply, Labour was too strong. It was getting too much of the pie, and the profit rate generally was beginning to fall.
So it was a profit crisis.
And you get a profit crisis, which in classic Marx, some people would say, well, this is a profit squeeze crisis. And many people wrote about this is a profit squeeze crisis which comes out of super organised labour, and the answer to it was to crush labour. And the answer to it was also, by the way, very significant. You crushed it in part by offshoring, but if you offshore, you need financial institutions which are deregulated, and so they allow funds to it. So you actually disempower the nation state over its own fiscal policies. So that's one of the things that happened after the 1970s. So that the nation state couldn't give generous pensions, couldn't give things because of the fiscal constraints of international bond markets and all the rest of it. So the crisis at the end of the 1960s had a lot to do with that. I mean, there were other things, a lot of other things going on too, but I would argue that was the basic problem back then, and therefore the answer was, crush labour. And since then, interestingly, the data show that there's been wage repression ever since the 1970s. The share of wages in national income has gone down. The average wage has remained pretty stagnant since the 1970s, went up a little bit in the Clinton years. This is the first time in American history when labour has not been able to share in the gains that come from increasing productivity. All of those gains went to the capitalist class. And the result is the tremendous increases in inequality that have occurred since the 1970s. The capitalist class has empowered itself, enriched itself, and it's done so largely at the expense of labour, with a good deal of pirating and pillaging going on in between, particularly with the shift from production capital to finance capital becoming very much more dominant.
So Billy?
Hello. So in California, amongst what we might call the left here, there's kind of a widespread nostalgia for this pre-70s class compromise or some kind of bare bones of the welfare state that might have existed here. But right now in California, we're facing, Governor Jerry Brown's new budget, which is like $12.5 billion in cuts. It's supposed to be somehow put into law in the next few months. So, real austerity measures. And given the weakness of the state locally and the state federally as well, is it really strategic for an antagonistic social force or the left or whatever you might call it to shape themselves to make demands of the state? So, I mean, what can you, or what do you imagine is the state can possibly do that would be worth demanding at this moment? Or as you say, grasping, you know, at this point. Grasping parts of the state, I guess is what you're referring to.
Well, I mean, one of the things I really find incomprehensible is why we're not taxing the rich more. I mean, you've got a lot of rich people in California. I don't know what the local tax is, but here in New York City, we have a new governor, and there was a surtax on very rich people, and he's abolished that. Now, this is a moment when you need more revenue, and yet he abolishes one of the important sources of revenue, which is to give more money to the rich folk. And so there are lots of things that could be done in the realm of taxation, for example. I mean, I fail to understand how American people can imagine that they can have not pay taxes while they're fighting two wars across the other side of that huge defense budget. I mean, why wouldn't we be paying for that, and why wouldn't some of the people who are benefiting from all of that pay more than the rest of us? So there are things that can be done through the state. I mean, for example, most of the upper classes don't make money out of incomes. They make it out of capital gains. And capital gains is part of change, is 15% tax rate as opposed to 30% or 35%. What is the tax rate? So we have all kinds of lopsided ways in which the rich are actually being subsidized. And of course, what Bush did was to subsidize them even more. And there seems to be an almost infinite capacity of that group of people to say, give us more, give us more, give us more. And so there are, it seems to me, ways to start to curb that. Now, I don't have any nostalgia for the social democratic class compromise of the 1950s, 1960s. It was, for me, it was far, far too concentrated in a white male working class. It did not incorporate mass of the population. The unions at the time were simply about defending the membership of their membership, and they were not about a socialist program for the country as a whole. They were not behind that at all. So there are many things that I would say we don't want to go back to that. In fact, it would be appalling to go back to that. I would want to see, look, there's a different kind of world we can construct, but it has to be much more egalitarian, and one of the places to start would indeed be by taxation arrangements. But of course we have the far right, which is kind of going on and on and on and on about taxes, 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 taxes. And therefore that's an ideological mantra that is very hard to get past. But I think that one of the things that the left needs to do is to really campaign on raising taxes. I mean, it's an unpopular thing to do, but raising taxes on those who can most afford it, in order to provide social programs for those who are most in need. I mean, what we're doing is we're cutting programs which help the poorest and the neediest in the population. We're taking out the costs of this crisis on the backs of the least fortunate people in the country, and they're doing it globally, by the way. So this to me is a real problem of politics right now.
There you go.
Well, you answered Yelena's question earlier by saying that people internalize the inevitability of neoliberalism, and also quoted Thatcher saying that there is no alternative. I think my question is, and we were discussing this earlier, considering your book, that throughout the book you touch upon alternatives, but there is really no underlying in this book what this real alternative is for you.
Right.
My question is, what alternative to neoliberalism did you picture when you were writing this book? What is neoliberalism?
Go for it, David.
Well, I have in a book called Spaces of Hope, I laid out a kind of utopian world that imaginary. We can all structure those kinds of imaginaries. So I didn't have a problem of imagining some kind of world that is radically different from this. So the big problem for me, and this has also come up in the last book I did, is how to get from here to there. You know, what is the process, and what is the process of thinking and strategizing, which will allow us to engage in a radical transformation of the kind of world in which we live. Now, that radical transformation is not impossible, and I would use the history of neoliberalism to point out how it is possible. I mean, neoliberalism changed the world, okay? If they did it, we can do it. And then, so it's very important to look at how they did it and what the strategy was. Now, of course, they had a lot of class power and a lot of money power. And one of the things we've seen over the last 30 years is the total corruption of politics with money power. And so that has been one of the ways in which they have, you know, have done it. Now, we have to undo that. We have to get money power out of politics. It's going to be very difficult to do, but you're going to have to do it. We do not have a democracy in this country. We have a democracy of money. And we have, as Mark Twain once said, that we have the best Congress that money can buy. And so we need to, you know, there are many things of this sort. And one of the things I did most recently in the Enigma book is to start to think about, you know, different areas of transformation. There are technological changes. There are changes in relation to nature that have to be really seriously considered, given the way in which, you know, natural conditions are being radically transformed through human action. Transformations in social relations, in class relations, and gender relations, and so on. So there are many fronts upon which you can imagine a political process unfolding. And to me, that actually is I think a very interesting way to look at it. And what neoliberalism did was it moved on the mental conceptions and ideological front very strongly. It moved in terms of social relations very strongly, so that we started to internalize the way we relate to each other. I mean, we related to each other in a very different way in the late 1960s than we do now. I mean, it's palpable, you know, in terms of, you know, we don't, you know, there were solidarity groups in the late 1960s which were all over the place, and you would never think of going on your own on things, but now it's kind of really changed. So there are many things of this sort. So I'm not so much concerned about, you know, the utopian vision. I certainly can, you know, trot one of those out if you like, but I'm very interested in the process of political movement, of political change. And if they change the world, we can change it back, but also, excuse me, change it in a different direction.
But to what?
Well, I think the first thing they have to do is to think about 3% compound growth forever is impossible. So we have to think about a zero growth economy. Now, zero growth doesn't mean no change. And there's a big distinction I'd like to make between growth and development. I think the development of human capacities and powers is one thing. Growth of the sort that we're increasing more of this and more junk of that and more of something else, and we're compounding that, is another thing entirely. So I think we should start to concentrate more on increasing human capacities and powers, and less on just making things. So, and that is very important in terms of environment. It's very important in many other modes. I mean, 3% compound growth was not a bad idea when capitalism was constituted by what went on in Manchester, Birmingham, and a few other places in Britain, and a few other places in, say, 1750. Now we're talking about 3% compound growth on what's going on in China, what's going on throughout much of South Asia, what's going on in Europe and North America and South America. I mean, 3% compound growth on that forever? Just imagine what the world is going to be like. And part of the economic breakdown that we've been experiencing over the last period in particular has been, I think, the fact that we are hitting limits to that compound growth. It's an inflection point, if you like, in the history of capitalism, and I think this is a very important thing to have in mind. So whatever we move to, we have to move to a zero growth society, but a positive development society. And there are many thinkers who are beginning to think that. Even the United Nations now has the UN Development Report, which is very different from the other, and that development report periodically gets into great, high, people get mad as hell at some of the things they say in there. And the directors of those reports periodically get fired, I've noticed, but because they're beginning to say things which are not exactly consistent with the neoliberal agenda. And I think there is a sort of thinking about that beginning to go on.
So, Professor Harvey, perhaps we can take one last question for you.
Okay.
Aaron?
My question is about what you call the curious relationship between the state and nation in the chapter titled The Neoliberal State. So like Ernest Renan and Benedict Anderson, you seem to suggest that national identity serves as national pride or of national soul-searching, mostly for people within a national container, even if you assert that nationalism mediates symbolic domination, forms of domination among states vis-a-vis global sports competitions. But in a neoliberal age, could states also manufacture these imaginary communities for a global audience of globe-trotting capitalists and tourists who will then and only then find their way, money, and capital to countries with mature and cohesive national narratives? For example, Thailand's economy significantly depends on tourism, and I was just in Johannesburg this winter, our winter, and South Africa's national sort of building projects certainly seem to sort of refract and reflect toward a global audience. So I was wondering if you thought that your analysis of national identity and nationalism stopped short of a more market-connected analysis of a profoundly ideological project, and or could we connect nationalism back to neoliberal economic interests?
Well, I think you can, this is a complicated kind of question. I'm not saying that it's an easy connection, but there are certain ways in which neoliberalism trades upon, if you like, national or local identity. And the way I guess I would put it most obviously is in what I would call sort of urban entrepreneurialism. That cities often city managers see themselves as a corporate entity in competition with other cities. And they try to mobilize their populations around a project of trying to attract capital or trying to attract business. And of course one of the ways in which they do that is to try to sell local culture and all the rest of it. If you don't have sort of some ancient culture, you bring in Frank Gehry to build you the Bilbao Museum or something of that kind to sort of attract people. So people suddenly know where Bilbao is because Frank Gehry put a museum there. So I think in this case, the collectivity, i.e. the municipality or the city region or something like that, starts to behave as a competitive entity in the global economy. And it relies very heavily on social solidarities within. I mean, nobody's going to go to a city, nobody can go to Cairo right now, I mean, this is one of the big problems. The tourist industry is completely destroyed in Egypt right now because of what's going on. So you can't have that sort of thing going on. You need social solidarity within an economy. And the same thing happens at the nation level. That actually at the national level there's a certain trading that goes on. And again, it depends very much on the nature of the state itself. A certain trading goes on about national traditions, national culture that come to France. France is a very special kind of place, and I can eat the mushrooms and drink the wine here in New York City, but somehow or other it's supposed to be all taste and feel very differently when you're doing it, in France. So I think that these things get traded upon, particularly cultural elements. Now, I'm not saying that nationalism is simply about that, but I'm saying that business uses notions of national identity and cultural specificity as part of a selling point for what it is doing. And the tourist trade does very much the same thing. So that there is an overlap, if you like, between the neoliberal competitive ethic and the way in which nationalism gets fostered and captured. But there are dilemmas in this. That is, if people are so nationalistic that they don't want to see any foreigners around and they're unwelcoming to foreigners, then this gets difficult. If they don't want to see people of a different colour or a different headgear or something, it gets difficult. So the nature of the nationalism has to be pacified into a kind of neoliberal mode, which to me has been one of the things, by the way, that has happened quite a lot. Now, I'm not saying that's all there is. In fact, there's a lot more to it, but I don't see nationalism and neoliberalism as being totally incompatible in these dimensions. And it was, I think, emphatic to me that Princess Margaret Thatcher, who on the one hand is a dyed-in-the-wool neoliberal, but on the other hand, she was a little Englander. When it came to Europe, she was kind of like, we don't want anything to do with those Europeans. I mean, this is kind of the, we're England, we're, blah, blah, blah. So there's a tension, a political tension around this, which can get out of hand one way or the other. So, but I don't think it's entirely incompatible.
Well, Professor Harvey, sadly, we're out of time today, but I want to thank you very much for taking the time.
Well, thank you for having me
with us. It's been a fascinating conversation.